The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. At 23 years old, he had dreamed of this moment since he was a small boy watching the changing of the guard with his grandfather. The weight of his bearskin hat felt heavier than usual, but it wasn't the physical burden that pressed down on him. It was the significance of the day. Today marked his first official duty as one of the Queen's Guard, standing sentinel at the most important royal residence in Britain. His polished boots reflected the early morning light as he marched to his position beside the ornate palace gates. The familiar sound of his footsteps on the gravel seemed to echo with the footsteps of countless guardsmen who had walked this same path before him. Thomas came from a long line of military men. His great-grandfather had served in World War I, his grandfather in World War II, and his father had been a career soldier before retiring as a sergeant major. The Mitchell family had always believed in duty, honor, and service to the crown. When Thomas received his assignment to the Queen's Guard, his father had gripped his shoulder with tears in his eyes and said, "Son, you're not just protecting a building or even a person. You're protecting everything our country stands for." The training had been rigorous and demanding. Months of drilling, learning protocols, and understanding the sacred traditions of the Guard had prepared him for this moment. He knew that as a Queen's Guard, he was expected to remain motionless and silent regardless of what happened around him. Tourists might try to make him laugh, children might wave, and people might ask him questions. But his duty was clear: stand firm, stay alert, and protect the crown with his life if necessary. As Thomas took his position, he could already see the first tourists of the day beginning to gather. Some carried cameras, others pointed excitedly at his red uniform and tall black hat. He had been warned about this during training. The Queen's Guard had become something of a tourist attraction, but he must never forget that his role was not to entertain. It was to guard. The palace behind him hummed with quiet activity. Staff members moved efficiently through the halls, preparing for another day in the life of the royal household. Thomas knew that somewhere within those walls, members of the royal family were beginning their daily routines, trusting in the protection provided by guards like him. His sergeant had pulled him aside the previous evening for a final briefing. "Mitchell," the gruff man had said, "tomorrow you join a brotherhood that stretches back centuries. Every man who has stood where you'll stand has faced tests. Some are small, dealing with difficult tourists or standing through harsh weather. Others are more significant. The key is to remember your training and never compromise your duty, no matter who asks you to." Those words echoed in Thomas's mind as he settled into his stance. His rifle felt comfortable in his hands, and his eyes began their practiced scan of the area around him. He noted the positions of the other guards, the location of the security cameras, and the steady flow of people beginning to gather for the morning's activities. The early morning air was crisp, and Thomas could smell the distinctive London mixture of car exhaust, morning coffee from nearby cafes, and the faint scent of flowers from the palace gardens. His stomach rumbled quietly, reminding him that he had eaten only a light breakfast. The next 2 hours would test his physical endurance as much as his mental discipline. A group of school children arrived with their teacher, their excited chatter filling the air. They lined up near the fence, pointing at Thomas and whispering among themselves. One brave little girl waved enthusiastically, her face bright with wonder. Thomas felt a small smile tug at the corner of his mouth, but quickly suppressed it. He was no longer Thomas Mitchell, the young man from Yorkshire. He was a Queen's Guard, bound by centuries of tradition and duty. The teacher began explaining to the children about the history of the Guard, how they had protected British monarchs for generations, and how the soldiers were real military personnel, not just ceremonial figures. Thomas appreciated that she was teaching the children to respect what he represented, rather than treating him as entertainment. As the morning progressed, more visitors arrived. Tour groups with guides speaking various languages, families on holiday, and local Londoners heading to work all passed by his position. Some stopped to take photographs, others simply glanced and continued on their way. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes constantly moving to assess any potential threats while maintaining his stoic expression. His training had taught him to be aware of everything while appearing to notice nothing. He observed the nervous businessman checking his watch repeatedly, the elderly couple arguing quietly about which direction to go, and the young woman taking selfies with the palace in the background. None of them posed any threat, but his vigilance never wavered. The uniform that had felt so crisp and perfect that morning was beginning to warm under the strengthening sun. Sweat began to form under his bearskin hat, but Thomas ignored the discomfort. He had endured much worse during training exercises in Scottish Highlands and Welsh valleys. This was just another test of his resolve. As the morning approached its midpoint, Thomas reflected on the trust placed in him. Millions of people around the world respected and admired the Queen's Guard. They represented stability, tradition, and unwavering dedication in an increasingly uncertain world. Every child who watched in wonder, every tourist who photographed him with reverence, and every British citizen who felt pride at seeing the red tunic was counting on him to uphold that reputation. The sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention, though he gave no outward sign of noticing. A man in an expensive suit was walking purposefully toward the palace gates, his stride confident and commanding. Thomas's trained eye automatically assessed the newcomer, tall, well-dressed, probably in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Little did Thomas know that this approaching figure would soon test everything he had learned about duty, protocol, and the unwavering commitment required of a Queen's Guard. The morning that had begun so perfectly was about to become much more complicated. General Marcus Whitmore had enjoyed a distinguished career in the British Army spanning over 30 years. His chest bore the weight of numerous medals and commendations earned through service in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. At 54, he carried himself with the authority of a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers and made decisions that affected the lives of many. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, and his expectations of immediate compliance had never been questioned. This particular morning found the general in an unusually irritated mood. He had been summoned to an emergency meeting at the Ministry of Defense, only to discover upon arrival that the meeting had been postponed by several hours due to a scheduling conflict. Rather than waste the morning sitting in a waiting room, he had decided to walk the short distance to Buckingham Palace to conduct some informal business with the palace guard commander. The general's relationship with protocol had always been complicated. While he understood its importance in military operations, he had grown accustomed to the flexibility that came with his rank. Doors opened for him, appointments were rearranged to accommodate his schedule, and junior officers rarely questioned his decisions. This sense of entitlement had been reinforced over decades of successful leadership, making him somewhat impatient with what he perceived as unnecessary bureaucracy. As he approached the palace gates, General Whitmore's mind was focused on the conversation he planned to have with the guard commander. There had been some concerns raised about security protocols during recent state visits, and he wanted to discuss potential improvements. His intention was straightforward: request access to speak with the commander, present his concerns, and arrange a follow-up meeting to implement changes. The sight of the young guardsman standing at attention near the gates initially pleased him. The soldier's posture was excellent, his uniform pristine, and his bearing properly military. General Whitmore approved of such standards and felt a brief moment of pride in the quality of British military training. However, his appreciation quickly turned to expectation as he approached. The general had grown so accustomed to immediate recognition and deference that he rarely considered the possibility of being challenged or questioned. His rank was clearly visible on his uniform, his authority unmistakable, and his purpose legitimate. In his mind, gaining access to the palace grounds would be a simple matter of identifying himself and stating his business. Behind his confident exterior, General Whitmore was dealing with personal pressures that contributed to his impatience. His wife had been diagnosed with a serious illness the previous month, and the strain of balancing her care with his military responsibilities was taking its toll. The postponed meeting that morning felt like another unnecessary obstacle in an already difficult period of his life. Additionally, the general had recently been passed over for a promotion he had expected. While he maintained his professional composure, the disappointment had left him feeling the need to assert his authority more forcefully than usual. He was a proud man who had dedicated his life to military service, and any perceived slight to his position struck at the core of his identity. As he walked the final steps toward the palace gates, General Whitmore mentally rehearsed the conversation he expected to have. He would approach the guard, identify himself, and request immediate access to speak with the palace guard commander. The young soldier would undoubtedly recognize his rank, snap to attention, and promptly arrange for someone to escort him inside. It would be efficient, respectful, and entirely appropriate given his position. The morning sun reflected off the brass buttons of his uniform as he drew closer to Thomas's position. Several tourists noticed his approach and began pointing, clearly recognizing his military bearing and high rank. Some raised cameras, assuming they were about to witness some sort of official ceremony or inspection. The general was accustomed to such attention and barely acknowledged it. What General Whitmore failed to fully appreciate in that moment was the fundamental difference between his role and that of the Queen's Guard. While his authority was substantial within the regular army structure, the Palace Guard operated under an entirely different set of protocols and command structures. The young guardsman standing before him answered to a different chain of command and was bound by traditions and regulations that superseded normal military hierarchy. The general's experiences in combat zones and military bases had taught him to expect immediate compliance from subordinates. In those environments, his word was law, his decisions final, and his authority absolute. The idea that a junior soldier might refuse his request or question his instructions was so foreign to his experience that he simply hadn't considered it as a possibility. His stride remained confident as he approached Thomas's position. The general's eyes swept over the young soldier's appearance, noting with approval the attention to detail in his uniform and the proper military bearing. This initial positive assessment reinforced his expectation of cooperation and respect. The gathering crowd of tourists created an unexpected audience for what the general assumed would be a routine interaction. School children pressed against the fence, their teacher explaining the significance of the ceremonial guards. A tour group from Japan prepared their cameras, excited to witness what they assumed would be an official military protocol. General Whitmore's breathing was steady, his expression controlled, and his purpose clear as he closed the final distance to the gates. In his mind, he was simply a senior officer conducting legitimate business with a subordinate unit. The complexity of palace protocols, the independence of the guard's command structure, and the absolute nature of their duty to remain at their posts regardless of who might approach were concepts that hadn't fully registered in his thinking. The morning air carried the sounds of London awakening, traffic in the distance, conversations among tourists, and the distant chiming of Big Ben. All of these familiar sounds formed the backdrop for what was about to become a very public demonstration of the unwavering commitment expected of those who guard the crown. As General Whitmore prepared to speak, he had no idea that he was about to encounter one of the most fundamental principles of British military tradition, that certain duties are absolute and cannot be compromised, regardless of who might request otherwise. The next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and the true meaning of unwavering commitment to duty. The moment arrived with all the weight of inevitable collision between two different worlds of military tradition. General Whitmore stopped directly in front of Thomas, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement with military precision. The tourists around them sensed something significant was about to happen and began focusing their cameras and attention on the scene unfolding before the palace. "Gates, guardsman," the general spoke with the crisp authority that had commanded respect across multiple continents. His voice carried the expectation of immediate acknowledgement and compliance. "I am General Marcus Whitmore of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. I require immediate access to speak with your commanding officer regarding urgent security matters." Thomas felt every muscle in his body remain perfectly still, even as his mind processed the situation rapidly. His training had prepared him for exactly this moment, though he had never imagined it would come so early in his first official duty. The protocols were crystal clear. No one, regardless of rank or title, could command him to abandon his post or break the sacred traditions of the guard. The general waited for what he considered a reasonable moment, expecting the young soldier to respond with the appropriate military courtesy. When no response came, he felt the first stirring of confusion mixed with irritation. Perhaps the guardsman hadn't heard him clearly, or was momentarily uncertain about proper protocol when addressed by such a senior officer. "Soldier, I am speaking to you," General Whitmore said, his voice slightly louder and more insistent. "I am ordering you to arrange immediate access to your commanding officer. This is a matter of national security importance." The gathered crowd began to murmur among themselves, sensing the tension building in the interaction. The schoolteacher quietly moved her students back a few steps, recognizing that they might be witnessing something more serious than a routine tourist encounter. Camera phones emerged from pockets and purses as people realized they might be capturing something extraordinary. Thomas remained absolutely motionless, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the general's shoulder. Every fiber of his being wanted to respond with proper military courtesy, to acknowledge the senior officer's rank and authority. His father had taught him to respect the chain of command, and every instinct built through years of military training urged him to snap to attention and comply with the general's request. But stronger than all of these impulses was the weight of his oath and the clarity of his training as a Queen's Guard. He had sworn to protect the crown and maintain his post regardless of circumstances. The protocols were not suggestions or guidelines to be interpreted based on convenience. They were absolute commandments that had been tested and proven over centuries of faithful service. The silence stretched between them, becoming more charged with each passing second. General Whitmore's face began to show the first signs of genuine anger as he processed the unprecedented situation of a junior soldier completely ignoring his direct orders. In 30 years of military service, he had never encountered such blatant insubordination. "This is absolutely unacceptable," the general said, his voice rising enough that more tourists began to take notice. "I am a general in the British Army, and I am giving you a direct order. You will acknowledge my authority and arrange for me to speak with your superior immediately." A middle-aged woman from the tour group whispered to her husband, "Is that soldier allowed to just ignore him like that?" Her husband, a retired police officer, shook his head uncertainly. "I don't know, love, but there must be some reason he's not responding." Thomas could feel sweat beginning to form under his bearskin hat, but not from the warming sun. The pressure of maintaining his composure while a senior officer loudly demanded his compliance was testing every aspect of his training. He was acutely aware that dozens of people were now watching the confrontation, some recording it on their phones, turning what should have been a private matter of military protocol into a very public spectacle. The general took a step closer, close enough that Thomas could smell his aftershave and hear the slight wheeze in his breathing that suggested years of stress and command pressure. "Young man, I don't know what sort of game you think you're playing, but this ends now. I am not a tourist to be ignored or some civilian to be impressed by your statue routine. I am your superior officer, and you will show me the respect my rank demands." From his peripheral vision, Thomas could see other guards at their positions around the palace. He knew they were aware of the situation, but were similarly bound by their duty to remain at their posts. The support he felt from their shared commitment to duty gave him strength, even as the general's anger continued to escalate. A news photographer who happened to be in the area noticed the commotion and began taking pictures from a distance. The scene was developing all the elements of a story that could potentially embarrass both the military hierarchy and the palace administration if not handled properly. General Whitmore's military bearing remained straight, but his face was beginning to flush with a combination of anger and embarrassment. The public nature of the confrontation was making the situation more complicated with each passing moment. He had expected a brief professional exchange that would grant him access to conduct his business. Instead, he found himself engaged in what appeared to be a battle of wills with a junior soldier, who seemed determined to humiliate him in front of an audience. "This is your final opportunity to comply with my orders," the general said through gritted teeth. "If you do not immediately arrange for me to speak with your commanding officer, I will have you written up for insubordination and conduct unbecoming. Your military career will be over before it has properly begun." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, witnessed by dozens of onlookers who were beginning to realize they were watching something far more significant than a routine tourist interaction at Buckingham Palace. The confrontation had reached a critical point where General Whitmore's authority and Thomas's duty were locked in absolute opposition. The growing crowd of spectators created an amphitheater of judgment, with camera phones capturing every moment of what was becoming an extraordinary test of military protocol and tradition. Thomas remained as still as a statue, but his mind was far from passive. He was mentally reviewing every aspect of his training, every regulation he had memorized, and every piece of advice his instructors had given him about maintaining his position under pressure. The weight of centuries of tradition rested on his shoulders, and he understood that his response in this moment would either honor or disgrace every guardsman who had stood in his place before him. The general's frustration had evolved into something approaching rage. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he struggled to maintain his composure in front of the watching crowd. Never in his distinguished career had he encountered such blatant disrespect for military hierarchy. The young soldier's complete lack of response felt like a personal attack on everything he had worked to achieve. "I don't know what sort of theatrical nonsense you think you're performing," General Whitmore said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "but you are a soldier in the British Army first, and whatever ceremonial role you're playing comes second to military discipline and the chain of command." A retired sergeant major in the crowd recognized the escalating tension and felt compelled to intervene. He approached cautiously, his own military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. "Excuse me, General," he said respectfully, "but I believe the Queen's Guard operates under special protocols that might be different from regular Army procedure." The general turned sharply toward the interruption, his eyes flashing with irritation at civilian interference. "This is a military matter that doesn't concern you," he snapped. "I suggest you mind your own business and allow me to handle this insubordination appropriately." The retired sergeant major stepped back, chastened but still concerned about what he was witnessing. His years of military experience told him that something was fundamentally wrong with the general's approach, but his respect for rank prevented him from pressing the issue further. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his mental battle against the pressure to respond. His training had included specific scenarios designed to test his resolve under exactly these circumstances. He remembered his drill sergeant's words: "The moment you break character for any reason other than genuine threat to the crown, you fail not just yourself but every guardsman who will stand after you." The physical demands of maintaining perfect stillness while under verbal assault were beginning to take their toll. Sweat continued to accumulate under his heavy bearskin hat, his legs ached from the rigid position, and his throat was dry from the morning air. But these discomforts were nothing compared to the emotional strain of being shouted at by a senior officer while unable to defend himself or explain his position. General Whitmore circled slightly, trying to force eye contact with the unresponsive guardsman. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," he commanded. "I have led soldiers in combat. I have earned the respect of my peers and subordinates through decades of faithful service, and I will not be disrespected by some ceremonial guard who thinks his costume makes him exempt from military courtesy." The harsh words cut deep, but Thomas forced himself to remember why he was standing there. This wasn't about personal pride or showing off for tourists. He was part of an unbroken chain of dedication that stretched back through centuries of British history. Men had died to protect the crown, had stood their posts through bombs and battles, had maintained their vigil through personal tragedy and national crisis. A palace security officer had noticed the commotion from inside the gates and was quietly radioing for guidance. The situation was becoming increasingly public and potentially embarrassing for all parties involved. News crews were often present around the palace, and social media could spread footage of the confrontation around the world within minutes. The general, sensing that his verbal assault was having no effect, decided to try a different approach. He stepped back and spoke in a more controlled tone, though his anger was still evident. "Soldier, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to conduct yourself appropriately. I am not asking you to abandon your post or neglect your duties. I am simply requesting that you follow proper military protocol and arrange for me to speak with your commanding officer through appropriate channels." This more reasonable approach created a new kind of pressure for Thomas. The general was no longer simply demanding compliance through rank and volume. He was appealing to military courtesy and proper procedure, making his request sound entirely reasonable to any observer who didn't understand the absolute nature of the guard's protocols. The crowd sensed the shift in tone and leaned in closer, expecting some kind of resolution. Children who had been watching with wide eyes tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why the soldier wouldn't talk to the important man. Adults whispered theories about what they were witnessing, some supporting the general's position, while others admired the guardsman's unwavering discipline. Thomas felt the weight of all these expectations, but he also felt the strength that came from absolute certainty about his duty. There was no ambiguity in his orders, no room for interpretation or compromise. He was to remain at his post, maintain his position, and protect the crown regardless of who might approach him or what they might demand. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows and making the confrontation feel even more exposed in public. What had begun as a simple request for access had transformed into a very public test of competing military traditions and the fundamental question of where ultimate authority resided in the British military system. The standoff had attracted the attention of Colonel James Harrison, the officer commanding the Queen's Guard, who had been alerted to the situation by the palace security team. A veteran of 25 years of distinguished service, Colonel Harrison understood both the absolute nature of the Guard's protocols and the delicate politics of dealing with senior officers from other branches of the military. From his position inside the palace, Colonel Harrison could see the confrontation unfolding through the security monitors. He recognized General Whitmore immediately, having served under him briefly during a joint operation in Afghanistan several years earlier. He also recognized the impossible position that both men had created for themselves and the need for immediate intervention before the situation escalated further. The colonel moved swiftly through the palace corridors, his mind working through the diplomatic complexities of the situation. General Whitmore was a respected officer whose intentions were undoubtedly honorable, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the unique nature of the Queen's Guard's authority and responsibilities. Meanwhile, Guardsman Mitchell was performing his duty exactly as trained, but the public spectacle was becoming damaging to all parties involved. Outside, the tension had reached a breaking point. General Whitmore's patience had finally snapped completely, and he moved to within inches of Thomas's position. "This is absolutely the last time I will ask you politely," he said, his voice low but filled with barely controlled fury. "You will acknowledge my rank and authority, or I will personally ensure that your military career ends today." The tourists and onlookers had formed a loose circle around the confrontation, with some people beginning to take sides in whispered conversations. A group of American tourists seemed impressed by the guardsman's unwavering discipline, while some British observers felt the general deserved more respect. The scene was becoming increasingly charged with competing opinions about duty, respect, and proper military behavior. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but his exterior remained perfectly composed. His training had prepared him for this exact scenario, teaching him that the most difficult test of a Queen's Guard was not physical danger, but the psychological pressure of being commanded to abandon his post by someone who appeared to have legitimate authority. The young guardsman drew strength from his memories of his grandfather's stories about standing guard during the London Blitz. Those men had maintained their posts while bombs fell around them, trusting that their duty transcended personal safety or comfort. If they could stand firm under enemy fire, he could certainly stand firm under verbal pressure. General Whitmore raised his voice again, this time loud enough that people across the street began to take notice. "This is conduct unbecoming of a British soldier. You are bringing shame on the uniform you wear and dishonoring every principle of military discipline." The harsh accusation of bringing shame on the uniform struck particularly hard, as Thomas took immense pride in representing the traditions and values of the British military. But he also understood that the greatest shame would come from abandoning his sacred duty, regardless of who might demand it. A young journalist who had been covering a different story nearby noticed the commotion and began taking photographs from a discreet distance. She recognized the potential significance of what appeared to be a senior military officer being ignored by one of the famous Queen's Guards. Her editor would definitely want to know about this developing story. The psychological pressure on both men was becoming intense. General Whitmore was fighting to maintain his authority and dignity in front of an audience that was clearly questioning his behavior. Thomas was fighting to maintain his composure while being publicly berated by a senior officer whose rank he had been trained to respect. Throughout his military career, Colonel Harrison finally emerged from the palace, moving with purposeful stride toward the confrontation. His appearance immediately changed the dynamic of the situation, as both the general and the gathered crowd recognized that someone with authority to resolve the matter had arrived. "General Whitmore," Colonel Harrison called out as he approached, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "What a pleasant surprise to see you here this morning. I understand you wish to speak with someone about security protocols." The general turned toward the colonel with visible relief, finally encountering someone who recognized his rank and treated him with appropriate respect. "Colonel Harrison, thank you for responding. I've been trying to arrange a brief meeting with the guard commander, but this soldier has been completely unresponsive to my requests." Colonel Harrison nodded diplomatically, understanding both men's positions perfectly. "I see. Well, General, I am the officer commanding the Queen's Guard, so perhaps I can assist you directly. Guardsman Mitchell here is performing his duty exactly as prescribed by regulations that date back several centuries." The colonel's words created a moment of sudden clarity for everyone present. General Whitmore began to realize that perhaps the situation was more complex than he had initially understood, while the watching crowd sensed that they were about to learn something important about the traditions they had been witnessing. "Perhaps we could step inside where we can discuss your concerns more privately," Colonel Harrison suggested diplomatically. "I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about the protocols governing the Queen's Guard and how they differ from standard military procedure." The general's expression began to change as the implications of the colonel's words sank in. For the first time since the confrontation began, he started to consider the possibility that his approach might have been inappropriate rather than the guardsman's response being insubordinate. The revelation hit General Whitmore like a physical blow, as the full implications of Colonel Harrison's words began to register. The confident authority that had carried him through 3 decades of military service suddenly felt uncertain and misplaced. The watching crowd sensed the shift in dynamics, and several people began to murmur among themselves, as they realized they might have been witnessing something very different from what they had initially assumed. Colonel Harrison's diplomatic tone carried just enough authority to command attention, while avoiding any direct confrontation with the general's dignity. "The Queen's Guard operates under royal warrant," he explained carefully, "which means their chain of command runs directly through the crown, independent of normal military hierarchy. Guardsman Mitchell's silence isn't insubordination, it's the highest form of military discipline." The words hung in the air like an education that General Whitmore was receiving in front of dozens of witnesses. His face, which had been flushed with anger, now began to pale as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. The traditions he had been trying to override weren't just ceremonial protocols, they were sacred duties that had been established by royal decree and maintained for centuries. Thomas remained perfectly still throughout this explanation, but inside he felt a wave of vindication and relief. His actions had been correct, his training sound, and his commitment to duty properly placed. The doubt that had crept in during the general's verbal assault began to dissolve, replaced by renewed confidence in the importance of his role. The gathered tourists and onlookers began to understand what they had witnessed. The American family, who had been sympathetic to the general's position, now looked at Thomas with new respect, while the British observers felt a surge of pride in their military traditions. The school children, who had been confused by the adult conflict, began to see the guardsman as something heroic rather than simply stubborn. "You see," Colonel Harrison continued, maintaining his diplomatic tone, while ensuring his words carried to the interested crowd, "the Queen's Guard has maintained their posts through world wars, terrorist attacks, and every conceivable form of pressure or distraction. Their silence and stillness aren't performances for tourists, they're demonstrations of absolute commitment to duty." General Whitmore's military mind began to process the situation from this new perspective. He thought about his own career, the times he had demanded unwavering loyalty from his subordinates, and the pride he took in soldiers who followed orders without question even under difficult circumstances. The very qualities he valued most in military service were exactly what the young guardsman had demonstrated. "The protocols governing the Queen's Guard," Colonel Harrison explained, "specifically state that no one, regardless of rank, title, or apparent authority, can command them to abandon their post or break their silence except in cases of immediate threat to the crown or direct orders from their own command structure. The Education was delivered so diplomatically that it allowed General Whitmore to save face while understanding his error. He began to see that his mistake hadn't been malicious, but rather born from a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Guard operated. His anger began to transform into something approaching embarrassment and, surprisingly, a grudging respect for the young soldier who had withstood his pressure. A veteran in the crowd, who had initially supported the general's position, spoke quietly to his wife. "I think I understand now. The boy wasn't being disrespectful, he was being the best kind of soldier. The kind who doesn't compromise his duty no matter what." The journalist who had been photographing the scene realized she was documenting something remarkable, not a military confrontation, but a demonstration of how tradition and duty could supersede even the most established forms of authority when properly understood and applied. Colonel Harrison gestured toward the palace entrance. "General, if you'd like to discuss your security concerns, I'd be happy to arrange a proper meeting. We can address any issues through appropriate channels while respecting the protocols that govern our operations." General Whitmore nodded slowly, his military bearing still intact, but his understanding completely transformed. He looked at Thomas with new eyes, seeing not an insubordinate soldier but a young man who had demonstrated the kind of unwavering commitment to duty that had made the British military respected worldwide. "Before we go inside," the general said, his voice now carrying a very different tone, "I believe I owe this guardsman an acknowledgement." He stood at attention and offered a crisp military salute to Thomas, who remained motionless, but whose eyes flickered with surprise and appreciation. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause at this gesture, recognizing the grace and honor in the general's acknowledgement of his mistake. The salute lasted several seconds, a formal recognition from one soldier to another that transcended rank and hierarchy. "Guardsman Mitchell," General Whitmore said, though he knew the soldier couldn't respond, "you have demonstrated exactly the kind of discipline and commitment that makes me proud to serve in the same military. I apologize for my misunderstanding of your protocols and commend you for your unwavering dedication to duty." The tourist who had been recording the confrontation now found themselves documenting something entirely different, a powerful moment of mutual respect between two soldiers from different traditions but united in their commitment to service. Several people wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the transformation they had witnessed. Colonel Harrison smiled approvingly at the general's gracious response. "This is precisely why the Queen's Guard commands such respect worldwide, General. They represent the absolute best of military tradition, duty above all else, commitment without compromise, and the understanding that some responsibilities are sacred." As the two senior officers prepared to enter the palace for their discussion, the crowd began to slowly disperse. But many lingered, looking at Thomas with newfound appreciation for what he represented. The school children who had initially been confused now understood they had witnessed something important about duty and tradition. The American tourist family approached the fence one more time before leaving. The father, a veteran himself, stood quietly for a moment in respect before shepherding his family away. "Now that," he told his children, "is what real discipline looks like." The morning sun continued its climb across the London sky, but the atmosphere around the palace gates had completely changed. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into a powerful demonstration of the values that the Queen's Guard represented. Thomas remained at his post, still perfectly motionless, but now carrying the satisfaction of knowing that his commitment to duty had been tested and proven unbreakable. The incident would be talked about for weeks among palace staff, military personnel, and the tourists who had witnessed it. But for Thomas, it was simply another morning of doing his job, protecting the crown with unwavering dedication, regardless of whatever challenges might present themselves. 3 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the reverberations of that morning's events continued to spread through military circles and beyond. The story had been shared in military academies as an example of unwavering commitment to duty, discussed in leadership courses as a case study in understanding different command structures, and retold countless times by tourists who had witnessed the extraordinary demonstration of discipline. General Whitmore had returned to his duties with a fundamentally changed perspective on military tradition and the nature of authority. His experience with Guardsman Mitchell had prompted him to examine his own leadership style and assumptions about hierarchy. In his subsequent commands, he demonstrated a deeper appreciation for the various traditions and protocols that governed different military units, ensuring he understood their unique requirements before making demands. The general had also taken the unprecedented step of writing a formal letter of commendation for Thomas, which was forwarded through proper channels to his commanding officers. In it, he praised the young guardsman's exemplary demonstration of military discipline and unwavering commitment to duty in the face of significant pressure. The letter became part of Thomas's permanent military record and helped establish his reputation as an outstanding soldier. The word of the incident had reached the highest levels of the palace administration. The Queen herself had been briefed on the events, and while she made no public comment, those close to her indicated that she was pleased with the demonstration of loyalty and dedication shown by her guard. The incident reinforced her confidence in the men and women who protected her and her family. Thomas had completed his rotation with the Queen's Guard with distinction and had been offered several opportunities for advancement within the military. His performance during the confrontation with General Whitmore had become something of a legend within the Guard, and new recruits were told his story as an example of what it meant to truly honor their oath. The young guardsman had also received hundreds of letters from people around the world who had seen footage of the incident on social media or read about it in news reports. Military veterans wrote to express their admiration for his discipline. Parents wrote to thank him for providing an example of integrity for their children, and tourists who had been present that day wrote to share how the experience had changed their understanding of military service. Colonel Harrison had used the incident as a teaching moment in his discussions with other military leaders about the importance of understanding and respecting different military traditions. He had been invited to speak at several conferences about leadership and protocol, using the morning's events as an illustration of how proper training and clear expectations could enable junior soldiers to perform their duties with confidence even under extreme pressure. The wider military community had embraced the story as validation of their core values. In an era when military service was sometimes questioned or undervalued, the image of a young soldier standing firm in his commitment to duty resonated powerfully with both active personnel and veterans. The incident became a symbol of what made military service noble and essential. For the tourists who had witnessed the confrontation, the experience had provided unexpected insight into the serious nature of the ceremonial roles they had come to see. Many reported that their visit to London had been transformed from simple sightseeing into a deeper appreciation for British military tradition and the sacrifice required to maintain it. The school children who had been present that morning continued to talk about what they had seen for weeks afterward. Their teacher incorporated the incident into lessons about duty, respect, and standing up for what you believe in. Several of the children expressed interest in military service, inspired by Thomas's example of quiet courage and unwavering commitment. On quiet evenings, Thomas often reflected on that morning and the lessons it had taught him about the nature of duty and authority. He had learned that true military discipline sometimes required the courage to stand firm against pressure from those who appeared to have authority over you. More importantly, he had discovered that his training and the traditions of the Queen's Guard were strong enough to sustain him through any challenge. The incident had also strengthened his appreciation for the wisdom embedded in military traditions that had been refined over centuries. The protocols that had seemed rigid and arbitrary during training had proven their worth when tested in real circumstances. Every ceremonial detail, every requirement for silence and stillness, served a deeper purpose in maintaining the integrity of the Guard's mission. General Whitmore occasionally drove past Buckingham Palace during his visits to London, and he always felt a sense of pride when he saw the guards at their posts. His encounter with Thomas had reminded him why he had chosen military service in the first place: the honor of being part of something larger than himself, the satisfaction of maintaining standards that elevated ordinary people into extraordinary guardians of important values. Years later, both men would look back on that morning as a defining moment in their military careers. For Thomas, it was proof that his commitment to duty was unshakable. For General Whitmore, it was a humbling reminder that true authority comes not from rank alone, but from understanding and respecting the traditions and responsibilities that give military service its meaning. The Queen's Guard continued their ancient vigil, standing firm against whatever challenges might come, carrying forward the legacy of unwavering dedication that had been tested and proven once again on that memorable morning at Buckingham Palace.